The monitors had gone flat. The doctors stepped back. In the most exclusive private suite at Mercy Grace Hospital, Elizabeth Hartwell, one of the most formidable businesswomen in the country, knelt beside her 8-year-old son's bed, gripping his limp hand while a team of the nation's finest specialists quietly admitted there was nothing further they could do. The air carried the mingled scent of antiseptic and defeat, and then, from a corner of the waiting area just past the glass partition, a black man in his early 40s, dressed in a worn jacket and scuffed work boots, rose from his seat and started toward the door. He wasn't a physician, he wasn't a specialist, he was simply a single father, yet within minutes he would accomplish what no one else in that building could. If stories like this stay with you, consider subscribing, because there's more where this came from. The fundraising gala at Mercy Grace had unfolded smoothly for most of the night. The ground floor ballroom had been dressed up to look elegant, crisp white linens, dim ambient lighting, a string quartet stationed by the entrance, while donors in tailored suits and designer gowns drifted between tables, trading small talk over wine and signing checks with the quiet confidence of people who believed money solved nearly everything. David Reeves had been there since 4 in the afternoon, tucked behind a speaker column near the back wall, fixing an audio cable the venue's regular technician had wired incorrectly. He wasn't a guest, he was the man nobody bothered to notice twice. David, 42, broad through the shoulders but unassuming, had the kind of face trained to stay neutral in spaces where he didn't belong. He worked for a modest electrical contracting outfit in town, steady enough work to cover rent and feed his daughter. His 7-year-old, Sophie, had tagged along that evening since her after-school program had closed early and he couldn't reach the neighbor who usually watched her. She sat in a folding chair near the service entrance, feet swinging above the floor, absorbed in a coloring book with the singular focus only children manage amid noise. Nobody at that gala could have guessed David had once operated in conditions far more chaotic than a faulty sound system. 2 deployments in Afghanistan as a combat medic had taught him to read a room instantly, to catch what didn't fit, to remain composed while everything else fell apart. He'd come home with steady hands and a mind that catalogued detail automatically, whether he wanted it to or not. In the years since leaving service, he'd tried to let that instinct go dormant. After his wife Rachel died 3 years earlier, it became simpler to disengage entirely from medicine, from hospitals, from the version of himself that once believed stepping in was ever worth what it cost. He hadn't set foot in a hospital since signing her death certificate. Elizabeth Hartwell arrived at the gala the way she arrived everywhere, a touch late, immediately noticed. 45, dark hair pulled back in a style suggesting command rather than vanity, dressed in a charcoal gown that was costly without being loud. She was the founder of Hartwell Ventures, one of the most influential private investment firms on the East Coast, an empire she'd built on sharp intelligence and a flat refusal to be underestimated. She was the evening's top donor, having pledged a substantial gift to the hospital's pediatric cardiac program, an irony that wouldn't surface until later. Walking beside her was Nathan, her 8-year-old son, stiff in a small blazer he clearly hated, tugging at the collar as they crossed the room while Elizabeth redirected his hand with the practiced patience of a mother who'd fought this exact battle many times. Nathan was the single constant in a life she'd rebuilt from the ground up after her divorce 3 years prior, bright, curious, prone to asking questions at the worst possible moments, and in every way that mattered to her, the reason she got up each morning. The night went smoothly for close to 2 hours. David finished the cabling, checked the audio levels, and settled into a chair near the service corridor to wait out the event before packing his gear. Sophie had dozed lightly against his shoulder. Speeches began. Elizabeth was introduced to applause, said what was expected, and returned to her seat. Nathan, beside her, grew restless the way children do once they've run out of patience for adult functions, folding and unfolding his program booklet when a small stir near the entrance drew nearby guests' attention and caused a brief crowding at the door. Nothing dramatic, no one fell, no one was pushed, but in the shuffle Nathan took a glancing hit to the chest from a man's elbow as the man stepped aside to avoid the crush. It wasn't forceful, not the sort of thing that would alarm a parent. Nathan winced, pressed a hand to his sternum, and glanced up at his mother with the uncertain look of a child deciding whether something merits tears. Elizabeth touched his shoulder and asked if he was fine. He said yes, and she believed him. For minutes later, Nathan's face drained of color, not gradually, but all at once, like a dimmer switch flipped. He blinked slowly, reached for his mother's arm, and then simply collapsed. The chair scraped back as Elizabeth caught him. He was out cold before he reached her lap, lips faintly tinged blue, his breathing shallow and uneven enough to send nearby guests stumbling back. The room transformed within seconds. Someone shouted for a doctor, several were already moving. Within 3 minutes a medical team from the upper floors had been paged and was converging on the ballroom. Within 6, Nathan was on a gurney headed to the private treatment wing. The initial assessment was swift and confident: anaphylaxis, a severe allergic reaction likely triggered by something eaten at the event. The response followed a well-worn protocol: epinephrine, airway support, for fluids, executed with practiced efficiency. Elizabeth was guided into the hallway outside and told the team had it handled. David had watched it all unfold from 30 feet away, unmoved from his chair at first, partly because Sophie had startled awake and needed settling, partly because the room was already full of capable people. He watched the gurney vanish through the corridor doors, watched Elizabeth follow, sat with Sophie until she drifted back off, then stayed put because there was nowhere else to go and the gear still needed packing. The gala had effectively wound down, staff moved quietly, the quartet had stopped playing. An hour passed. Most of David's equipment was coiled and boxed. Through the glass panel by the corridor doors he could make out the edge of the private wing, not the room itself, but enough hallway to catch movement, a nurse passing, the steady amber light above the door signaling active use. He wasn't watching on purpose, he simply noticed things, always had. When a second cart was wheeled in, this one carrying crash equipment, not a standard trolley, something in his attention sharpened. He stood without deciding to, moved toward the glass. Through the narrow window he could see the monitors above Nathan's bed, the team working, and from their positioning and equipment, he could tell they were still running the anaphylaxis protocol, escalating it further, more epinephrine, more aggressive fluids. David studied the boy's skin, no hives, no swelling at the face or throat, lips still faintly blue but no visible edema, none of the external signs that almost always accompany true anaphylactic shock in a child. He looked at the cardiac monitor. Even from that distance and angle, the waveform was clear enough for eyes trained to notice what the room hadn't yet paused to examine. The T-wave pattern was off, not in the way of a body in allergic shock, but in the way of a heart misfiring electrically. He'd seen that pattern before, not in a hospital, but in a field kit on a dirt road outside Kabul, bent over a 23-year-old soldier who'd taken a low-velocity blow to the chest during a vehicle incident, whose heart had chosen, at exactly the wrong point in its electrical cycle, to stop. Commotio cordis, a disruption caused not by force but by timing, a blunt impact landing in that narrow window between heartbeats. In a child with an undetected structural defect in the heart wall, symptomless until the right trigger found it, the result could look identical to this. The team inside was treating the wrong condition entirely. Every dose of epinephrine they gave was stimulating a heart that needed to be slowed and stabilized, not pushed harder. David stood at the glass for a long moment, hands still, face still, though something behind his eyes moved fast, weighing, calculating, surfacing memories he'd spent 3 years trying to bury. The last time he'd been certain about something medical, he'd said nothing, deferred to the doctors, told himself they knew better, told himself it wasn't his place. He'd signed the certificate 7 days later. Sophie stirred behind him, small and asleep, coloring book open across her knees. He looked back at her, thought about what it would mean to walk through that door, the resistance he'd face, the sight he'd make, a man in work boots and a worn jacket telling trained specialists they were killing the patient they were trying to save. He thought about how that story usually ended. He thought about Rachel. Then he turned back to the glass, looked at the boy on the other side, and walked to the door, pushing it open before he could talk himself out of it. The nearest nurse turned immediately. The lead physician, a silver-haired man in his late 50s named Dr. Harold Whitfield, looked up from the bedside with the sharp, guarded expression of someone used to being interrupted by the wrong people. Elizabeth, standing in the far corner, straightened at the sight of him. David said plainly, without any lead-in, "You're treating the wrong condition." The room didn't respond the way it does in films. No one froze to listen. Dr. Whitfield's expression shifted from surprise to irritation within a second, and a nurse was already moving to call security. Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice carrying the precise edge of a woman who'd built a career on never being pushed around. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" David didn't look at her, he looked at Whitfield, because Whitfield was the only person in the room whose next choice would matter. "I know how this looks," he said. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to look at his T-wave on that monitor and tell me what you see." Security arrived in the doorway behind him. Dr. Whitfield raised a hand slightly, not toward David, but toward the guard, a reflexive gesture buying himself 2 more seconds to think, and looked at the monitor. The waveform sat there, quiet and damning, tracing the same aberrant pattern it had held for the past hour while everyone in the room had been watching everything else. Whitfield studied it for a long stretch. The guard held his position, nobody moved, the monitor beeped steadily through the silence while David stood in the center of the room, out of place in every visible way, entirely certain of the one thing he couldn't yet prove, and waited. Whitfield stared at the monitor for 7 seconds, David counted them, then turned back to the room wearing the expression of a man who'd found something he wished he hadn't, not quite alarm, but the careful stillness of recalibration. "Hold the next dose," he told the nurse at the 4 line, his voice level in a way that clearly took effort. The nurse looked up, startled, since the next epinephrine push had already been drawn and protocol called for it, but Whitfield's hand came up again in that same commanding gesture, and she set the syringe down. Elizabeth moved forward from her corner. "What's happening? Why did you stop?" Whitfield didn't answer her right away, he looked at David instead, a long, assessing look that strips a person down to what they actually know versus what they merely claim. "You said the wrong condition," Whitfield said. "What condition are you treating?" David told him, keeping it brief, the T-wave anomaly, the absence of hives or swelling, the chest impact 40 minutes before Nathan collapsed, the narrow electrical window that made commotio cordis possible, the likelihood of an underlying structural defect that had never shown itself before now. He used the terminology correctly, having spent years earning the right to, even if nothing about his appearance in that room suggested it. Whitfield listened without cutting in, which was itself a kind of answer, and when David finished, Whitfield turned to his team. "I want an echo, now. Get cardiology on the phone." Elizabeth stepped directly into Whitfield's path. She wasn't a woman who waited at the margins of conversations concerning her son. "Someone needs to explain who this man is and why he just changed my son's treatment plan." Whitfield held her gaze steadily. "Ms. Hartwell, right now I need you to let us work." She didn't move at first, studying David, the worn jacket, the total absence of any credential explaining his presence, and something in her expression shifted between fury and something harder to name. Then she stepped aside, not out of trust, but because the alternative was continuing to fight in a room where her son's heart was beating wrong. The echo technician arrived within 4 minutes, the on-call cardiology fellow came through the door 90 seconds later. David stayed near the wall, out of the way, watching the monitor with the quiet focus of a man who'd learned that sometimes the most useful thing you can do is simply not leave. The security guard had retreated to the doorway but hadn't left either. Nobody had formally invited David to stay, and nobody had told him to go. The echo took 11 minutes. When the images resolved on the technician's screen, the cardiology fellow leaned in, straightened, leaned in again, and pointed to a structural irregularity along the atrioventricular wall, small, congenital, the kind of defect that produces no symptoms under normal circumstances and would never surface on a routine checkup. Under ordinary conditions, Nathan could have lived another 10 years without knowing it was there. Under the specific conditions of that evening, a low-impact blow to the chest landing at exactly the wrong moment in his cardiac cycle, in a boy with a hidden structural weakness, it had been enough. Whitfield ordered the protocol reversed, beta blockers to stabilize the electrical activity, careful cardioversion to guide the rhythm back to normal, epinephrine abandoned altogether. The team moved with a different kind of urgency now, not the confidence of people executing a familiar routine, but the focus of people who understood what was at stake in getting this one right. 8 minutes into the new protocol, Nathan's heart rate began to steady, not dramatically, not the sudden cinematic turnaround of a body choosing to live, but gradually, number by number on the monitor, each shift small enough that you had to watch closely to believe it was real. But it was real. The blue tint at his lips faded by degrees, his oxygen levels climbed back into range, and by the time the attending cardiologist arrived from the upper floors, the immediate crisis had been pulled back from the brink. Elizabeth stood against the far wall, arms crossed, eyes fixed on her son's face, having said nothing for 20 minutes. When Nathan's hand twitched, a small involuntary flex of his fingers, the first voluntary motion since he'd gone under, she pressed her knuckles briefly to her mouth, then lowered her hand. She didn't look at David, but in the new quiet of the room, as the monitors settled toward normal, her eyes drifted briefly his way before returning to her son. The inquiry began before morning. By the time Nathan had been stabilized and moved to a monitored bed in the cardiac unit, someone on the hospital's administrative staff had already filed an internal incident report. An uncredentialed man had entered a patient's room during active treatment, offered clinical direction, and that direction had altered the care plan of a high-profile patient. Legal counsel was looped in by midnight. By 6 a.m., a local news van sat outside the main entrance, antenna raised. The story that reached the public first was the version that wrote itself easiest: an unlicensed man intervenes in a billionaire's son's emergency care. The truth underneath was messier, but messy details don't spread as fast as clean headlines, and the clean version cast David as either a reckless outsider who got lucky or a fraud who'd inserted himself into a vulnerable moment for reasons yet unexplained. Both versions circulated before noon. David learned of it from a neighbor's text at 7:45 that morning. He was at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, Sophie eating cereal across from him, and he read the headline without expression while she asked if she needed her raincoat for school. He told her yes. The sky looked uncertain, set his phone face down, and finished his coffee. The hospital's review board reached him that afternoon through a formal letter delivered to his employer's office, requesting his presence at a hearing within 48 hours, polite, free of direct accusation, but the framing, unauthorized access to patient care areas, potential violation of medical practice statutes, wasn't meant to put him at ease. His boss, a decent man named Frank who ran the contracting business out of a converted garage in the warehouse district, called him personally to say the hospital had reached out, his tone careful, like a man unsure which side of the situation he was standing on. Inside the hospital, opinion had split along predictable lines. Two physicians who'd been present during the initial treatment, neither of whom had caught the T-wave anomaly themselves, gave statements to the board suggesting David's intervention had caused confusion and unnecessary delay, crediting Nathan's improvement to the team's own adaptive response rather than any outside input. Dr. Whitfield's statement was different, factual, unembellished, confirming exactly what had happened and in what order. The gap between the two accounts was itself telling, but review boards move slowly, and in the meantime the public narrative was being shaped by people who hadn't even been in the room. Elizabeth's team managed the fallout on her end. Hartwell Ventures communications director drafted a statement within hours of the first news cycle, and the board of directors was in touch by morning. The hospital treating Nathan was one of two medical institutions Hartwell Ventures had funded heavily over the past 4 years, and the unspoken implication, never stated outright but perfectly understood, was that continued funding wasn't entirely separate from how publicly the hospital chose to handle the David Reeves situation. Elizabeth issued no statement and never left the hospital. She spent the night in the chair beside Nathan's bed, and when her communications director brought a tablet with a drafted paragraph at 9 that morning, she looked at it once and handed it back without a word. Nathan woke mid-morning, groggy and confused, asking for water. He didn't fully grasp what had happened, and Elizabeth kept the explanation simple. His heart had needed help, the doctors helped it, he'd be fine. He accepted it with the practical trust of a child who believes the adults around him have things under control, asked for the remote, and she handed it over before stepping into the hallway, back against the wall, not crying, Elizabeth Hartwell hadn't cried in a professional setting since she was 31, and she wasn't starting now, but her hands trembled faintly, and she noticed and made them stop. She thought about the man in the worn jacket, the way he'd spoken, not with the performative confidence of someone hoping to be believed, but with the flat, load-bearing certainty of someone who didn't care whether he was believed, who spoke because it was true and because silence was no longer an option he was willing to take. She didn't know what to make of that. She'd spent her career learning to spot people telling her what she wanted to hear versus people telling her the truth, and she was good at it, but this didn't fit cleanly into either box. She'd quietly asked someone on staff to pull whatever background they could find on David Reeves, not through official channels, just what was publicly available, and by early afternoon had a summary on her phone: U.S. Army combat medic, 2 deployments, honorable discharge, a stint with a civilian emergency response organization after returning home, then a gap, then the electrical work. A flag in the record from 3 years back, an internal review at a hospital tied to his wife's death, details unavailable informally, but the outcome was clean, cleared of wrongdoing, case closed. Elizabeth read it twice, put the phone away, went back into Nathan's room, sat beside him, and watched him watch television with the uncomplicated absorption of a boy who had no idea how close things had come, thinking about the internal review, the gap in the record, the way David had looked walking through that door, like a man who'd made a decision that cost him something. She didn't yet know the full shape of that cost. At 11:47 that night, the monitors in Nathan's room triggered a cascade alert. His oxygen saturation dropped 14 points in under a minute, his heart rate spiked and then fractured into the same irregular, dangerous pattern from the night before. The attending nurse responded within 30 seconds, the on-call cardiologist arrived 2 minutes after, and the room filled again with the controlled urgency David had witnessed through the glass the previous night. But this time was different. The structural defect, identified but not yet surgically corrected, was no longer staying quiet. The blockage was worsening, the stabilizing protocols from the night before weren't holding, and the on-call cardiologist was making emergency calls to the attending surgeon, running calculations on whether Nathan could survive a procedure or whether that window was already closing. David wasn't in the building when the alert fired. He was sitting in his truck in the parking garage, engine off, having come back after dropping Sophie at the neighbor's, not entirely sure why, telling himself he just needed to know the boy was stable before he could sleep. He'd been parked there for 40 minutes watching the entrance, not going in, phone still off in his jacket pocket since the news cycle started. He had no idea that above him, the 8-year-old whose heart he'd already saved once was running out of time again. He turned his phone on at 12:12 a.m. for no particular reason. He'd been sitting there nearly 90 minutes, and something in the quality of the silence around him had shifted, not a sound or a signal, just the particular stillness that settles over someone who's avoided a decision long enough that it starts to feel already made. The screen lit with notifications he didn't read. He opened his contacts, stared at nothing for a moment, then got out of the truck. The main entrance was still staffed. The night attendant recognized him, not warmly, but with the careful neutrality of someone briefed in advance. He said he needed to speak with Dr. Whitfield. She told him Whitfield wasn't on overnight rotation. He said he'd wait, and she picked up her phone. He sat in a lobby chair, hands on his knees, eyes on the floor. 20 minutes later a woman came through the interior doors at a pace just short of running. Elizabeth, still in yesterday's clothes, hair down, the composure she'd held for the last 24 hours worn thin and raw near the surface. The front desk had told her David Reeves was in the lobby, and she'd come down immediately, because with her son's monitors alarming upstairs and the surgical team struggling to find a foothold, David Reeves in the lobby was the most useful piece of information she'd gotten all night. She went straight to him. "He's crashing again," she said, the words flat not from calm but because she'd moved past the register where panic is loud. "It's worse than last night. They can't stabilize him." David stood. "What are they doing?" She described the cascade alert, the destabilized rhythm, the fact that the defect was progressing faster than expected, and that the on-call cardiologist was trying to determine if Nathan could survive an interventional procedure, relaying it all accurately, sequentially, without embellishment, having extracted it from the attending nurse with the same precision she'd use briefing a crisis team at her firm. David listened without interrupting, then asked, "The echo last night, was it a standard apical 4-chamber view?" Elizabeth said she didn't know what that meant. "It means the technician had him positioned flat, probe angled up from the lower chest," David explained. "Standard approach, gives a good general picture. But there's a modified view, subcostal oblique, patient tilted, probe repositioned, that gives a different angle on the atrioventricular junction. Last night I thought the standard echo was sufficient. But if he's deteriorating the way you're describing, there may be a secondary blockage the first imaging missed. In the field, without full equipment, that modified view was sometimes the only way to catch what we were missing." Elizabeth watched his face as he spoke. She'd spent 20 years reading people across negotiating tables, and she knew the difference between someone constructing a story in real time and someone reporting a fact they'd known for a while and were only now choosing to voice. This was the latter. "Why didn't you push for this last night?" she asked. "Because I wasn't sure it was necessary until now," he said, holding her gaze, "and because saying it means explaining how I know it, and that's a conversation I wasn't ready to have." "Have it now," she said. He told her in the hallway outside the cardiac unit, under fluorescent lights at 12:47 a.m., the muffled sounds of the team working on her son audible through the closed doors behind her, about Rachel, the months of misdiagnosis, symptoms accumulating into a pattern he'd recognized but couldn't name with the authority doctors required. The evening he'd sat across a desk from a physician and carefully said he thought they were missing something, and the physician's equally careful reply that his military training wasn't equivalent to a clinical diagnosis. About going home that night telling himself the doctor was right, that he was overreaching, that the guilt of believing he knew better than the professionals was just his ego dressed up as instinct. Rachel died 7 days later of a cardiac complication a different imaging angle might have caught in time. The internal review afterward cleared him because there was nothing to find. He hadn't been her physician, hadn't made a clinical error, hadn't done anything except fail to push hard enough when pushing felt like arrogance. The board had been thorough and fair and entirely beside the point. The question David had lived with for 3 years wasn't whether he was legally at fault, it was simpler and heavier. He'd known something, stayed quiet, and she'd died. Elizabeth listened without a word. When he finished, the hallway sat quiet, a nurse passing at the far end without a glance, the alert light above the cardiac unit door still amber. "You're telling me this," she said finally, "so I understand why you're certain." "I'm telling you this," David said, "so you understand what it cost me the last time I wasn't." She held his gaze a long moment, the full unguarded look of someone setting aside years of built-up judgment, then turned and pushed through the doors. Elizabeth walked straight to the attending cardiologist, a focused woman named Dr. Patricia Adebayo, coordinating the response at the central monitor station, and without asking permission or explaining. Herself said, "There's a man outside this unit who served 2 tours as a combat medic and believes there's a secondary blockage in my son's defect that your current imaging hasn't found. He knows a modified echo view that may reveal it. I need you to hear him out." Dr. Adebayo looked up, patience visibly worn thin. "Ms. Hartwell, my son is dying in that room," Elizabeth said, not loud, not a threat, simply a fact she was asking the other woman to weigh. "If he's wrong, you've lost 4 minutes. If he's right, you found what you're missing. I'm asking you to make that calculation." Dr. Adebayo made it, gesturing toward the door. David came in and described the modified subcostal oblique approach to the echo technician, a young woman named Megan with 7 years' experience and the professional composure not to let the strangeness of the moment slow her hands. She repositioned her equipment and adjusted the probe angle while David guided her with directional instruction that came from physical memory rather than theory, hands steady from conditions that made a hospital room look controlled by comparison. The image resolved on screen at 1:23 a.m. There it was, a secondary narrowing at the oblique margin of the defect, invisible from the standard angle, sitting exactly where the occlusion was driving Nathan's failing rhythm, small, unremarkable, exactly the kind of thing that could quietly kill a child while skilled physicians looked in the right place from the wrong angle. Dr. Adebayo studied it for 3 seconds, then turned to the surgical resident. "Get Dr. Bennett on the phone. Tell him we have a target." The procedure was catheter-based, less invasive than open surgery, appropriate for a defect of this size, carrying real risk but far less than doing nothing while Nathan's heart fought its own structure. Dr. Bennett, the attending cardiac surgeon, arrived from home within 40 minutes, reviewed the imaging standing up, asked 3 questions, got 3 answers, and said they were going in. David wasn't present for what followed. He was back in the hallway, seated against the wall in the particular stillness of someone who'd done the one thing they came to do and had nothing left to manage. Elizabeth sat beside him at 2:15, after the surgical team had taken Nathan and waiting became the only available action. Neither spoke for a while. The hallway stretched empty in both directions, the fluorescent light overhead buzzing faintly at a frequency just below irritating. "The review," Elizabeth said eventually. "After your wife. You were cleared." "Yes," David said. "But you left medicine anyway." "I left because being cleared isn't the same as being okay," he said. "Those are 2 different things, and I spent a long time mixing them up." She absorbed that, looking out a window at the end of the hall where the city sat dark and still. "I had someone pull your background yesterday," she said, without apology, since she wasn't someone who apologized for due diligence, though her tone carried an acknowledgement that it was something he deserved to know. "After last night, I wanted to understand who you were." "Figured as much," David said. "The gap in your record after the contracting work started," she said, not quite framing it as a question. "That's Sophie," he said. "That's just being her father." Elizabeth looked at her hands, thinking of Nathan tugging his collar at the gala, the small automatic irritation of redirecting him, the 1,000 unremarkable moments that made up having him in her life, and how easily that could have ended, not dramatically, without warning. Just a boy falling sideways in a crowded room while excellent physicians treated the wrong thing and the right answer stood outside a glass panel in a worn jacket. "I owe you something I don't know how to measure," she said. David shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. I'm going to disagree with you there." "That's your right," he said, "but I didn't come back tonight because of what you owe me. I came back because he's 8 years old." Nathan came through the procedure at 4:12 a.m. Dr. Bennett emerged from the surgical suite to tell Elizabeth the blockage had been successfully addressed, the structural defect repaired with a small catheter-deployed closure device, and barring complications, which he considered unlikely given the precision of the repair, her son would recover fully, needing monitoring and follow-up imaging over the coming years along with some temporary restrictions on contact sports, but otherwise expected to live an entirely normal life. Elizabeth thanked him, shook his hand, walked back to the hallway, sat beside David, and said nothing for a long while before quietly saying, "Thank you," 2 words, undecorated, unpadded, from a woman who'd spent most of her adult life keeping gratitude at a professional distance and was no longer doing so. David nodded once, looking tired the way people look when something long carried has finally been set down, not lighter exactly, but different, like a body still adjusting to changed weight. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth didn't offer David money. She understood from how he operated that it wasn't what he needed. Instead she used the full weight of Hartwell Ventures' influence to push Mercy Grace and 2 affiliated hospitals to adopt mandatory cardiac screening for pediatric patients, specifically targeting the class of congenital defects that had gone undetected in Nathan, and worked with Dr. Whitfield and Dr. Adebayo to formalize the modified imaging technique David had described into standard diagnostic training. No press releases, no public announcements, just making it happen quietly and completely, without asking for credit. David learned of it through a brief letter from the hospital's chief medical officer acknowledging his contribution and confirming the inquiry board would take no further action. Dr. Whitfield had submitted a final statement leaving no ambiguity about the sequence of events or David's role, and the 2 physicians who'd given contradicting accounts declined further comment. Once Nathan was well enough for visitors, he asked his mother to arrange a meeting with the man who'd helped him. Elizabeth brought David to the hospital on a Saturday morning, Sophie in tow with a drawing she'd made of the hospital, since Nathan had mentioned he liked art. Nathan had made something too, a drawing of 2 figures, one in a white coat, one in regular clothes, with the figure in regular clothes colored slightly larger, and he handed it to David without explanation, with the matter-of-fact generosity of a child who considers the meaning obvious. David took it home and put it on the refrigerator. That evening, after Sophie was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the apartment and thought about Rachel, not with the old weight, the particular heaviness of guilt carried so long it feels like part of the body, but the way you think of someone loved imperfectly, with tenderness, with the ordinary ache of absence rather than the sharp edge of a wound. He thought about the night she died and the night Nathan almost did, and the difference between them wasn't the outcome but the choice he'd made, the second time he'd spoken. That was all it took. He'd walked through a door and said what he knew to be true and refused to stay silent regardless of the cost, and it hadn't required a credential or a title or anyone's permission, it had only required him to stop mistaking his own silence for humility when what it had actually always been was fear. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, while outside the city carried on as cities do, indifferent, continuous, full of people moving through their own invisible emergencies, and somewhere across town an 8-year-old boy with a repaired heart slept in his own bed for the first time in 2 weeks, dreaming whatever children dream when the adults in their lives have, against considerable odds, managed to get things right, because the worth of a person has never lived in their credentials, but in what they choose to do when staying quiet would be easier, and when the cost of speaking up is something only they will have to carry. If this story moved you, subscribe and stay close, because there are more stories worth telling, and we're only just getting started.